there's so much power in telling ourselves the truth. So as you said, like when you say something out loud, like if that's the one thing we do is start telling ourselves and others the truth a bit more, that breeds confidence, that breeds authenticity, because there's not a disconnection between how I portray myself and who I actually am.
Welcome to the Authentic Man podcast. I am your host, David Chambers. This is a podcast for men who want more and less from life. More deep connection, more emotional intelligence, more self-awareness, and more great sex. And less heartache, less conflict, less overthinking, and less stress. Creating dating lives, sex lives, and relationships that are incredible and authentic. My deepest goal is that you, the listener, can take away what you hear in this podcast and apply it to your life so that you can experience greater happiness, transformational growth, deeper relationships, and profound sexual intimacy. I believe that as men, we are capable of so much more depth than we are shown or led to believe. So join me as we get deep into this. Welcome back to the Authentic Man podcast after a little break. I had to take a little break, rest up a little bit, think of some wonderful new episodes to record and live my life and so forth, and done all sorts of wonderful things since working with a lot of my different coaching clients. But I'm back now, back again, back with some amazing guests. I've got so many wonderful guests, and I've taken a lot of the topics for definitely the next kind of 20, 25 episodes of this season are coming from the things I see most in my clients, in my one-to-one work with men and also with couples as well. So stay tuned, lots of great episodes to come. But in this episode today, back with a topic that I think is probably one of the biggest underlying problems for a lot of men. A lot of men I work with is really the fear of judgment, but coupled with this fear and inability to get out of their comfort zone as well. And this is really a huge topic. When we start to move past our fear of judgment, we can start to live life more fully. And we start to concern ourselves less with what other people think. And also what you'll learn today, maybe the judgment is more about judging ourselves for the things that we are going to do and want to do. We have Pat Divilly with us, and I'm going to ask him to introduce himself because he's going to do it way, way better than I will. How are you doing, Pat?
I'm good. Thank you, man. I'm happy we get to do this. So, introduction, I guess I'm involved in men's work and breath work and personal development work, for lack of a better term. I've been in the fitness industry for 15 years. So I started out in the fitness industry in my early 20s. And after working in the fitness industry for a couple of years and having a good level of success, I think I started noticing that everyone's getting the same nutrition plan and the same training plan, but not everyone's getting the same results. And so that sort of prompted me to start looking at the mind with coaching and cognitive behavioral therapy. And then my own struggles with mental health led me to exploring more somatic stuff in recent years. So the likes of, connected breath work, trauma release exercises. And so I guess the path has been fitness initially, and then looking at the mind. And the last couple of years has been how do the mind and body come together. And I'm raving about this. I think it's the next trend, if you will. It's already there with the likes of Gabor Mate and, so many other great leaders. But yeah, that's been the long and the short of it, I guess. I started in fitness, and looking back, my passion really wasn't so much about fitness as it was bringing people together and giving a sense of belief. I used to always say that other trainers could teach you 100 push-up variations, but I was the guy that made you believe you could do a push-up, and that was the difference. I wasn't a genius by any means, but I could inspire people, and that's what I still try to do, whether it's with men's work or it's in the corporate space or whatever. So that's a bit of a background, I guess. And I love jiu-jitsu. That's my passion. And I love travel. And there's lots more, I'm sure.
Oh, it's beautiful. I love how you said it went from the from the body, a focus on the body and getting people into shape and probably also feeling good about their body, to seeing that the mind has had so much influence over people's bodies and how they were able to exercise and what they believe they could do. And then now you're seeing that it's a combination of the two at like a deeper level, from my understanding or what I've learned about kind of somatics and trauma, is like there's so much that we hold in our body that is influencing how our mind is, which is influencing how we are acting and being in the world.
Yeah. And, I mentioned what I saw in my clients in terms of their struggles with their self-talk and how that influenced me getting into coaching. But I guess my own personal struggles were being a very insecure boy and always believing that when I achieve things in life, I'll feel confidence and I'll feel fulfillment and happiness. And I went on this relentless pursuit in my 20s and woke up at 28 and I had ticked every box I thought I needed to tick. So amazing girlfriend, great friends and family, amazing business, bought a house, bought a car, haven't been broke 4 years before. My whole life had changed externally. But what surprised me was that my insecurities, it almost felt like there was a magnifying glass on my insecurities rather than them disappearing. So, working with clients made me want to understand the mind, but also my own struggles made me want to understand the mind. And so, I started getting good at reframing things and challenging my beliefs. But when I really struggled with my mental health, there was an impatience there that I can't fix this. Usually I can fix things. And I guess that's the warrior archetype, that idea that I'm just going to get it done. I'm going to achieve, I'm going to push past. And I guess I burned out at 28 and went to a psychologist. And she said to me that there's a fire alarm in your house that keeps you safe by going off when there's a fire. So it's really useful. If there's danger, it goes off and you can get to safety. But she said sometimes the fire alarm breaks and it's going all the time when you use the toaster or the oven, and now it's a pain in the ass. And she said, similarly, you've got a fire alarm within you that tells you, oh, there's danger here, there's stress here. But she said yours is just going all the time. And that was the reality. Was despite success, I just was wound up all the time. I was not sleeping. I couldn't look people in the eye. I felt like a fraud. I felt like an imposter. The more I achieved, the more I felt I was going to be found out. And so that led me to breathwork and all these other things. But anyway, I talk a lot, Dave, so cut me off if you need to.
No. As you know from listening to the podcast, my style is to get the most out of people, because I think that I know from speaking to people who have listened to podcasts, they love people's stories, they love guest stories, and your story is one I've heard from quite a few men that come to do the sort of work that you and myself do, is this of like getting the material success, like getting all the things we kind of thought, especially when we're kind of late teenagers, we want all the stuff of the world, like the stuff that's going to mean that everyone looks at us and goes, oh, he's successful. And then there comes a point we get all those things, we tick them all off, and then we look at our lives and we're like, I thought I'd be really happy and like overjoyed, and I don't feel like that. And it's this kind of sense of, for me, it was like a sense of emptiness. I was like, wow, I've got all the stuff. I've got a house. I've got property that I rent out. I've got a lovely girlfriend and I can do what I want. I travel when I want. And then I was like, but, oh, wait a minute. I should feel really happy. Everyone told me consciously and unconsciously that this stuff would make me feel good and this would make me feel successful. And I didn't feel that way. And it really kind of, for me, it really hit me like a bit of a ton of bricks and left me feeling like, wow, okay, so what do I do now?
It's a weird space to be in, because for many, it might be the first time in their life where they can't point to something and say, that's why I'm unhappy. Like, that was my experience. Was in the past, I was unhappy because I was single, or because I was broke, or because I was being criticized on the internet, or I always had a reason. But this was like the first time where all the ducks were in a row, and it was like, oh, I still feel miserable. And I think, a common pattern is you either do it to yourself or other people kind of put it on you that, oh, you should be happy. You should feel grateful. You should appreciate what you have. And so then there's like a shame element, almost denying what you feel. So one of my teachers is called Francis Weller. He's amazing. And he does a lot of work around grief and initiation and different things. But Francis Weller talks about emotional maturity being the capacity to hold grief and gratitude at the same time. So that kind of springs to mind when I look back. Could I have? Well, I couldn't, because it was what it was. But if I could go back in time, that capacity to be grateful for what I've got, but also acknowledge that I'm in pain here, and something needs to shift, something needs to change. So I would just say, if anyone's listening and in that space of not allowing themselves to feel what they feel, can you hold both? Can you hold appreciation for what you have and also hold the reality of the pain that sometimes is there in life? We sometimes think of grief as being the death of a loved one, but there's so many layers of grief. It could be the grief of my youth, the grief of my last job, the grief of my being single, so many different things. So life is always changing, and I think a lot of depression and challenge for me in my life has been trying to hold on to what's gone.
Yeah, as you said so well, there is often we think of grief as just losing someone. We don't always see grief as like grieving the loss of something we never actually had, or something we can't see ourselves having. It's like that sort of grief also weighs incredibly heavily on us as well. And as you wonderfully said, it's like we see it as very binary. Like I can either be like have grief or be grateful. And sometimes we'll try and override our grief or our sadness or upset because we kind of, for whatever reason, we believe that we should be happy because we have all the things or our life's a certain way. And we don't realize that, as you said, it's like we can hold both those kind of polarities at the same time. And in fact, it's very mature of us to, because that is the kind of the nature of life. There will always be things for us to grieve, and there will also be things for us to be grateful for, pretty much exactly the same time.
Yeah. It's interesting. I did a seminar a couple of months back, and I was talking about how, as children, possibly our parents, with the best of intent, will have said, "Don't be silly. Don't be scared. You cry because you're scared, and so don't be silly. It's only a spider." And there's this weird disconnect that happens because the child in their body is experiencing the sensations of fear and overwhelm, but the superhero grown-up is saying, "Don't be silly." And there's this kind of disconnect. Can I trust myself? Can I trust my body? I'm being told here that this is not real. And amazingly, I went for lunch the next morning, and a lady came up to me. She said, "I was at the seminar last night, and I went and I apologized to my child because last week I told her, 'Don't be silly for being afraid of spiders.' And I said to her, 'It makes complete sense that you're afraid of spiders, but you don't need to be afraid.'" So it was kind of affirming to hear that. But again, a lot of these patterns from childhood, I think we do the same thing to ourselves now. So it's like, I shouldn't feel this way. Don't be silly, man up, get on with it, all this kind of stuff. It's like a big piece that I focus on is like emotional awareness, in the sense of what do I feel and then what do I need. So if I feel lonely, I need connection. If I feel grief, maybe I need to cry. So it's kind of linking the two things together. And I often say to people that if a baby cries, we don't look at the baby and say, "The baby shouldn't be crying." We say, "Oh, the baby's like, baby needs something. Let's support the baby." And it will be a mistake to just put an iPad in front of the baby and say, "Hey, watch this, you'll be fine." It might keep them quiet for a bit. And then mirroring that to our own lives. Like when I cry or when I'm sad, I need something. I can pick up a hypothetical iPad in the form of beer or, meaningless sex or whatever it might be. But that's just numbing myself. So it's like, what do I really need?
It's like, it's like we feel something. We feel emotion, sadness, loss, emptiness, and we can take the easy option, right? The iPad, the beer, the drugs, the women. We can take the easy option that will distract us from the feeling that we have, or we can do the work to kind of look inside. Maybe it's contemplation, maybe it's journaling, maybe it's just sitting with ourselves a little bit and go, what is the thing that I really need, that my soul is really yearning for here, that will actually quench this thirst of this emotion that's there for us?
Yeah, I have a mentor in the States, and he talks about he'd work with a lot of indigenous people over the years, and he would talk about how in the West, because we live in the head so much and there's so much of a focus on logic, when we experience an emotion, which an emotion is a collection of sensations in the body, we kind of link, okay, there's all this stuff happening in my body, and then we give it a name. And as soon as we give it a name, we jump to our heads. So there's sensations in my body. I say I'm scared. Then I jump to my head and I build stories about why I'm scared. And now I try to outthink my fear. So I've left my body. And so sometimes it's a case of just closing the eyes and just naming, what do I feel in the body? I feel tension in my chest. Okay, can I stay with that for a few seconds? Okay, it's starting to ease. Okay, I feel my breath getting a little fuller. Okay, now I feel heat in my face. So I think that can be one piece. And as you say, just consciously, that's the piece I think, is consciously fulfilling our needs. Because I studied with Gabor for a year, and a big piece of Gabor's work is around addiction. And he'll sort of say that, all addictions serve a purpose. They're a means to escape pain. And so, I worked with a man years ago who was a gambling addict. And when I asked him what gambling was giving him, his response was, it's taking everything from me. It's not giving me anything. And I said, you do it for a reason. There's something there it's giving you. And when we peeled back the layers, we came to see that the bookies was the only place in his life where he felt a sense of connection. He didn't have family. He didn't have friends. And so on an unconscious level, his need for connection was being met through this destructive behavior. And so as we can start to unpack our own behaviors and say, why do I, like for me in my 20s, partying on the weekends, what did that give me? It quietened my busy mind. It gave me a sense of social connection where I wasn't the boss of a business. I got to be reckless and carefree and wild, because during the week I took myself too seriously. So it was giving me this, that, and the other, but it was also taking a lot from me. So I think once you start unpacking what your unhealthy behaviors give you, you can then find healthier ways of doing it. So now jiu-jitsu quietens my busy mind, gives me a social connection, gives me a place where I don't have to be so serious. And that kind of takes the shame away from addiction, I think.
Yeah. I love what you said there, to see that, in your 20s, you were going to things that are like not healthy for you, and like to consciously start choosing. And I see this a lot with men that I work with, that they have habits, kind of these neural pathways that are well trodden and been done for many years, and they're easy to go down. And when you start unpacking and with them and saying, hey, like, what's something else you could do instead of this? And I've even encountered sometimes like a defensiveness, like, oh, there's nothing else. You're like, oh, no, wait a minute. Like there's stop. We don't need an answer straight away. We can be patient. We can try some new things and fail at them or not be good at them, whatever. Sometimes we're very resistant to, it's kind of how the brain is wired for us to be resistant to new ideas and trying new things.
Change is the scariest thing, and change is the only constant. So it's kind of an interesting paradox.
Yeah. Wonderful. So I think it feels like an apt time to jump into this fear of judgment, this thing that rules so many people's lives. I see it from a point of view of people in their dating lives, for instance, and not taking any action. Or I see it in people in their relationships where they're so afraid of their partners judging them that they don't say the things they want to say. I see it in people's intimate lives. They're not trying the things that they want because, they're feared that their partner will judge them for their desires and their wants and their needs. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Like, what, if you had to kind of encapsulate, like, what is the kind of definition of the fear of judgment?
We go back to Gabor again, in a sense, but a lot of his work, and I've been heavily influenced by his work and Dick Schwartz and lots of other people, but there's a lot of these modalities and psychotherapies, and I think you go back as far as the Jesuits had a phrase that said, give me the boy until he's 7 and I will show you the man. So the idea that the first 7 years of our life creates such an imprint on how we see ourselves and others in the world. So I think that's where I would start in terms of those first couple of years. I always say we're this 360-degree personality in our formative years. That's a Robert Bly quote. So I express myself fully. I show all of myself. Everything's welcome. Everything's safe. Hopefully, if I grow up in a safe environment. But then when I go to school, suddenly I've got to start editing and filtering myself. Maybe I notice that when I cry, I'm made fun of. When I express too much joy, I say this as a man oftentimes. You can't show any emotion other than anger. If you show too much joy, you're seen as flamboyant. If you show too much tears, and so Gabor talks about this battle between authenticity and acceptance. So we all have these two polar things happening. One, we've all come into the world, I believe, as a soul that's supposed to express themselves authentically and honestly, and live our own purpose. And the other piece is we're tribal beings, and so we want to be connection. We want to be in connection, and it's terrifying to think about being out of connection. So I think in those formative years, we start to hide parts of ourselves that go into shadow, and we develop personas. So we've got the mask that we show to the world, and we start shutting down more and more of who we are. So shutting down belief systems, interests, hobbies, gestures, emotions, all this goes into the hidden box. So then in terms of the fear of judgment, I think it just comes down to that. We're tribal beings that want to be accepted, that want to be loved, that have a fear of abandonment, that have a fear of vulnerability, of someone seeing the true self. I really think those first 7 years just create such an imprint on how safe you feel in the world. And we learn in those early years that to be safe, it's good to be a chameleon and to shift into your environment. So I don't know if that directly answers the question, but I guess that's the fear of judgment piece. To me was interesting because what I noticed was people name different fears, but they generally come back to the fear of judgment. The fear of success is really, how will people judge me if I'm successful? The fear of failure, how will people judge me if I'm a failure? The fear of abandonment, how will I judge myself if someone walks away? How will people judge me if someone walks away? So it always comes back to, how will I be seen if worst case scenario happens?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's powerful. You say it's like there's this desire we have. Like we want people to accept us. We want people around us to accept us, because if they accept us, then we're going to have the connection and the love really that we yearn for, that feeling of being part of something bigger than we are. And then we have this worry that if we show who we are, so our vulnerability, who we are, then we'll be abandoned, and then we'll lose that very love and connection and acceptance that we want. And the kind of fear of abandonment is like our reaction to that kind of melting pot. Like, oh, if I get accepted, then way good. If I don't get accepted, oh my God, what does that mean for me? Like, what does that mean about me? Like, what are people going to think of me? How are they going to reject me? It's this like very complex fear. As you said, it's like it sits beneath so many things that we consciously realize as our fears. But it's this kind of big one that's maybe easily could say this is the most common fear that people experience. The most common fear that people experience is a fear of judgment. It impacts so many of our choices and decisions in our daily life.
Yeah, I mean, they say that fear of public speaking is right up there with the fear of death, and we're not afraid to speak. We all speak. It's if I stand on that stage and I say the wrong thing, I guess it's a primal part that is just saying, if I'm on my own, I'm in trouble here. I mean, I was bullied on the first day of school, and you can look back at your childhood stuff and you can say, oh, you got past it, it's all good. But if you put yourself back in the body of the child who was 4 or 5, and everyone else in the class goes to one side of the room and says, you're not allowed on this side of the room, again, the primal part is just like, this is terrifying. I don't want to be rejected. I don't want to be abandoned. We need each other. That's the key. So I think it's, in terms of overcoming the fear of judgment, I think there's a couple of things. One is that compassion for ourselves and that recognition that it is pretty primal. It is deep rooted. And, with archetypal work or with parts work, if people are familiar with parts work, this idea that we think we're one person maybe, but we're all these different characters that all have different motivations. So you've got a people pleaser, you've got a procrastinator, you've got a motivated part of you. And I think it's important to recognize that all of your different parts are doing their best to keep you safe. So the part of you that's terrified of judgment, you might hate that part of yourself. But if you can get curious and say, this might be a bit of a stretch to do right now, but if I was to connect with the part of myself that fears judgment and breathe into that space and see if I can locate it in my body. And if I were to ask that part, what is it you're afraid of? They might say, well, I don't know what they're going to say, but I listen to their answer. They might say, I just don't want you to be rejected. You've been rejected in the past. I don't want that to happen again. That was painful. So, oh, that makes sense. Okay, so it makes sense the way you're operating. Is there anything I could do for you to help you feel a little bit safer? And they might give a response. And it's starting to communicate with these different and really understand everything we do, every addiction, every impulsive behavior, every reaction makes sense on some level. And if you can get curious about your reactions, your impulses, your challenges, I think that's the work really. And then it's a practice. I mean, self-esteem is built on putting little deposits in the account every day. So if you're looking to overcome the fear of judgment, this might sound silly, but I remember last year, one of my little challenges for myself was I went to the surf shop and I bought quite I don't know what you call it, quite a flamboyant hoodie, like lots of color. And that was a stretch for me, because I just wear plain clothes all the time. And that's part of me. And I leave the shop and I'm like thinking everyone's looking at me and my flamboyant, nobody cares, you know what I mean? But now I wear that thing and I don't give it a second thought. So it's I think the biggest philosophy that serves me well in life is that we improve at the things we practice. So whatever you want to improve, you just got to practice. And that could be practicing being more authentic, practicing being more expressive, practicing leaning into your authenticity. Yeah.
And I'm going to circle back to something you said a little bit earlier. And you talked about judgment and rejection. And what hit me was I did a podcast episode with Stefanos Stefandos a couple of years back. And he talked about rejection as like we experience rejection as death, of all near certain death. Especially, I see it in the dating world, for instance, but, it comes along in many other areas like work and so forth. So it's like this fear of judgment is leading us to the fear that we're going to be rejected and ostracized from our group, our clan, our family, which would then lead certainly to our almost certain death in our very kind of primitive mind.
Mm. Yeah. This probably like circles in a sense back to our mind-body piece. So people are to think about our reactive behaviors and our defensive mechanisms and our coping mechanisms as being in the most primitive parts of the brain. And then our logic and our reason and our creativity and our compassion being in the newer parts of the brain. Anytime I experience fear, it's like the newer part of the brain goes offline and the older parts come into play for survival. And so that's why we play out the patterns. That's why I tell myself I'm going to be confident and I'm going to say hello to that woman that I'm attracted to. And it comes to it and suddenly my breath stops. I lose access to my prefrontal cortex and suddenly I'm back into fight or flight and I'm sprinting down the road to get away from her because I'm scared. So, in a practical sense, I think it's a case of having little tools there to recognize I'm activated here. I've lost access to my human brain and I'm back in my animal impulsive mind.
It kind of touches on what you were saying towards the beginning and when we start recording, where you talked about you went from being focused on the body to focus on the mind to focus on the mind body. It's like in these instances there, you so beautifully said, where, as a man, you're going to, I'm going to go and talk to this woman. I'm going to say something really funny. We're going to laugh. We're going to joke. And a lot of guys, they get there and then they are so hooked into the brain at that moment that they suddenly feel the anxiety, the mind, the kind of prefrontal cortex shutting down, the amygdala just like lighting up and taking over the show, the little baby coming out and all sorts of things in those moments. But if we have the kind of presence and awareness to check in with the body and go, what's going on below this little neck thing that I have here? And we might be able to stop and go, wait, my heart's beating really quickly. My hands are feeling a bit sweaty. My stomach, there's some butterflies there. And this can take some practice, but we can stop and go, wait a minute. This is just some sensation. As you said, it's just some sensations in the body.
Mm.
And actually we have some power in this moment to shift and change this. I can, you definitely know, and I know, is that I can use the breath. I can use my breath to slow things down, and I can use to relax, which will then start to shift my brain and my brain chemistry. And we can do this in a matter of seconds. It's just that often and I'm going to say here, men in particular, we're so disconnected from the body and so in the brain, we're so in that idea that the brain is the most superior piece of us and the bit that we should listen to the most, that we actually forget about all the wonderful wisdom and information that we could make use of that's happening in the body to actually start to take different action towards the things that we really want in our lives.
Yeah. Carl Jung had a quote. I mean, it's been used so much, but it's, until we make the unconscious conscious, it will run our lives, and we will call it fate. And that's basically saying we'll play out the same cycles until we start understanding why we're doing what we're doing. So then the question becomes, well, how do we unearth the unconscious parts? And one surefire way is to start noticing your reactions. Like, this is a really good way of, because the body, I'm full of sound bites today. The body remembers what the mind forgets. You know, the body remembers what the mind forgets. So I walk into a room and I lock eyes with someone, and my body kind of, I get a sinking feeling in my gut, and I kind of cognitively understand what's happening, but maybe there's a remembrance there of, you know, they're reminding me of someone that I've had difficulties with in the past or whatever it might be. So, you know, again, in a gentle and compassionate way, can we start to notice our reactions? Can we start to notice, you know, transparency? In recent times, I've noticed that my lack of boundaries at times, and then the frustration that comes with that results in me going into kind of shadow warrior and unloading and being quite impatient in my, you know, I get to the point where I'm like, oh, people have overstepped my boundaries, I need to say my piece. And I get a little bit impatient in it, and it's not delivered with skill. So that's a reaction that I notice in myself. I withhold and then I unload. And so I think part of my work in the coming months is to be a bit better on revealing myself in the moment rather than holding all this resentment and stuff like that. So that's what it is. I think recognize where you're reacting or where you're stuck or where you're cycling the same behaviors, and just commit to leaning into those edges a little bit. Stretch zone, as your partner says.
Yeah. And I love what you said there is, you know, acknowledging that people overstep your boundaries and you withhold. And I'm hearing that it's like you don't stand up for the boundary when it's being overstepped, and then you sit and withhold, and you generate that, not you generate, but the resentment starts to come up, like, oh, how dare they do that to me? Like, who do they think they are? Like, they can't treat me like this. And that whole narrative and story kind of whirls around your mind. And then there comes maybe a point where you're like, that's it. They're going to get it. They're going to get all of this. And then you kind of unload. But it's also really when you look at that, and I'm hearing what you said, is like you realize that we create these situations in our lives ourselves. You know, we think that other people are doing something to us, or they are making us feel something in some way, when really it was just simply a decision we didn't make, or we chose not to make, that creates more of a feeling in us that we dislike or unhappy with. And often that's a feeling that we experienced at some time in our life when we were much younger, for our parents, our caregivers, initial girlfriends, school, you know, the list goes on. And we kind of recreate these scenarios constantly in our lives. I have a theory that we are constantly putting ourselves into our patterns so we can break them. It's a little bit like I use an analogy with my clients. It's a bit like when you play video games. You're playing like Sonic, like, you know, full disclosure, I'm 38 years old. So like I remember playing Sonic and Mario, and you to get to the end and there's a boss, and you're trying to beat the boss, and you're like, boom, 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 boom. Then you die, and then you have to start the level again. It's like that process of dying and starting again. We could put ourselves straight back in the pattern because we want to move through. We want to make a different choice and have a different outcome, because it's almost like it's needed for our own evolution.
Yeah. And I think piggybacking off that maybe is sometimes terms like inner child work or shadow work, or different terms when we think about working on these parts of ourselves that have been repressed or denied. Sometimes I think when we first come to the work, we can see it as you complete the level and that's the level done, and then you just move on to the next thing. But there's also an element of the big bad boss that you need to beat. You need to consistently beat that boss, because, you know, the parts of ourselves that we meet in the shadow or in the inner child work, like if I notice a younger part of myself that kind of kept quiet because he was afraid to say the wrong thing or afraid to be made fun of, and then I always say to people that we all mature biologically, we're all getting older, but psychologically we often get stuck. And that's particularly true when we're triggered. Like when I have an emotional reaction, I shouldn't say it, but like I notice at Christmas time when my aunts and uncles come to visit, I watch my father, who's in his 60s now, revert back into a little boy, in the sense that, you know, when you're closest to your family, you revert back to the dynamics of who was the oldest sibling and kind of who's is speaking above each other and all this kind of stuff. So it's interesting to see that we think that I think I'm a 35-year-old man here, but I get rejected by a woman that I'm attracted to, and suddenly I feel like the 15-year-old boy couldn't get a girlfriend, and I start acting from that place, you know, and I'm listening to Papa Roach in Linkin Park. but my point is, when I start noticing these parts of myself, I think it's an ongoing relationship. I don't do my inner child work and it's done. It's like there's younger parts of me that felt neglected, and they play out and they kick up and they disrupt my life because they're like a child that hasn't gotten attention, so they start being childish. And so I need to take a little bit of space for them consistently and say, okay. So for me, with that boundaries piece, it's like I need to talk to that little boy that's afraid to speak up for himself and tell him it's safe. And that's an ongoing process, I think.
Yeah, definitely. The work always continues.
Yeah, the rabbit hole. Oh.
And you know, I know you do a lot of your work with men, and I'm interested, especially when it comes to the fear of judgment. Like, what do you see as how the fear of judgment really shows up in men's lives in particular? You know, because we have this socialization into masculinity, in particular. Like, how does that fear of judgment and how other people are viewing us and seeing us really manifest in men's lives?
Hopefully this ties. What I saw myself, and this was only a couple of years ago, I went to a plant medicine ceremony, and it was with Wachuma. I sat with Wachuma a number of times, San Pedro, and I started having all these memories of being scared as a little boy and learning that the way to deal with fear, to suppress fear, was to be competitive and to try and get ahead. So if I achieve, if I win, if I'm strong, and there was all these ways that I could avoid my fear or hide my fear. I kind of wept. I cried for hours in that ceremony, just recognizing how much my life was driven by fear and competitiveness. And the competitiveness was accompanied by a mistrust of men. Like, I don't trust men. I don't feel safe with men. I see them as my competition, not my friends. And so that got me thinking about, I suppose, how we're raised. And you know, I think a lot of the early years of a boy's life, at least for me, was team sports. And so there is a real competitive element to it. You're socializing through sport. You get more attention if you're good at the sport. So I think there's a competitive element that is bred into us in those early years, potentially. I mean, that's part of the West anyway, is, you know, it's a kind of me rather than we culture where I need to get ahead. I need to be the one, you know, this individualism, I guess. That alongside the narrow box of masculinity that we learn as kids. I'm sometimes hesitant to say these things because I'm not in the school system now, so I don't know how it looks now. You know, I know a lot of teachers are doing great work with helping kids to understand their emotions, but certainly for me, as I mentioned earlier, anger was the only emotion I felt was acceptable, because you didn't mess with me if I was angry. But if I was joyful or sad, or then I was a target. So when you've hidden all these aspects away for so long, I think the fear of judgment then is, well, the reason anything goes into shadow is because it was shamed. So if something is shamed, I collapse. I get, like, shame is something you'll feel in your body. You feel yourself getting smaller. And so if that's gone into shame or gone into shadow, and 20 years later, there's take the example of, the fear of getting out on the dance floor. If I learned as a boy, boys don't dance, or you can't dance, or people in our family don't know how to dance, we don't have rhythm. There's all these narratives, right? And so I will have learned that, and I will have collapsed into shame at some point. And as I say, we get better at what we practice, and we don't improve at what we don't practice. So if I've never danced, I'm not going to become a better dancer. But when I'm asked, hey, do you want to go on the dance floor? the shame emerges again, because that's and so it's, can I meet the shame with self-compassion? Can I be gentle with myself? Can I establish a practice if it's something that I want to improve upon? So I think that's the fear of judgment. It was hidden away for a reason. So then when it comes to the surface, it's very difficult unless you're quite aware to notice, okay, this stings, this is difficult, this feels uncomfortable, because at some point in my life I was told this was not a safe way to be, but I can change that pattern now. And it's, I mean, look, it's challenging work. I fear judgment, all the time. So, and that's maybe another piece that I don't know what I was watching recently, and the guy was basically saying motivation is overemphasized. He says, I don't feel motivated most of the time, but I go and do the thing. And it was kind of that wasn't specifically it, but it was something so simple. He was saying, stop waiting for inspiration, just go do the thing. And there is an element of that, that we can get caught in our heads, like waiting for, waiting to overcome our patterns, waiting for the perfect time, waiting for this, that, or the other. And at some point you just got to like go and do something different. Nothing changes.
Yeah, I know what you said there. And it's interesting you said about the schools, because I'm actually going to be going and speaking in some schools over the next couple of months. And it seems
Nice.
that box for young boys hasn't changed that much. They're still, expressing emotions. It's still like outside things they shouldn't be doing. And it's still something that causes a lot of young boys like stress and turmoil, and not really knowing how to, because I guess we all learn, we learn from our fathers. Look at my own father, he could barely go beyond being okay and being sad and being mildly happy. That was kind of his emotional range. And it kind of taps into what you said before, like trusting men. Like I could really see a point a few years ago where I realized I was on a retreat, and it was Vipassana actually. And the men who were kind of doing what's it called? The managers, because there's like the teacher, there's the manager, and I had all this resistance about going to them for anything. I was like, no. And I really, and you're doing Vipassana, just for context for everybody, this is a 10-day silent meditation. Whatever you're thinking, you don't have any distractions to really move away from what you're thinking, because it's there, it's with you the whole 10 days you're there. So I really observed a lot of my own patterns play out around like avoiding speaking to the teacher, avoiding going to the kind of the men's manager and all these sorts of things, because I didn't trust that if I had a problem, that somehow it wouldn't become my fault in some way. And I see this as something that a lot of men have. There's like a real lack of trust for men. It's why, I see men's work as being so valuable, because we go and be in spaces with men of different ages, and we get to experience ourselves being able to be vulnerable, like being able to show up and share our shame, our fears, our worries, and be seen and still accepted, to kind of almost override that judgment. But the thing that I really jumped out from what you said was, we said about the thing you watched around waiting for inspiration. I think this is a very important thing for the listener. I would like to put message just before this, because a lot of us are waiting for our fears to disappear before we can do the thing we want. We are like, oh, when my fear of dancing disappears, then I will dance. And it's often so important to remember, is like, that fear is not going to go anywhere. That might be with you for the rest of your life, I talk about my own self. I'm dyslexic. So I grew up, my whole life was like, you can't spell, your writing's terrible. Like no one wants to read or write, and being kind of picked at for all these things. So over the last kind of 4 years of going on Instagram and typing out my message and stuff like that, I still have the fear pretty much every single time I post that someone's going to go, I don't understand what you meant. You spelled something wrong there. There's a grammatical problem there, and blah, blah, blah. And it does happen. Sometimes people do, in their wonderful, lovely, judgmental way, tell me that I should use a free spell check, which I usually reply to them, dyslexia is also free. But it doesn't have to stop me. It doesn't have to, this fear I have doesn't have to stop me. But my experience is that when I do start to more and more kind of face those small fears, as you said before, with like a level of compassion. Like, why am I afraid? Oh, I'm afraid of, typing out in public because, for a little David when he was 8 years old, writing on the board in front of the class was like, literally, I was about to die. I thought I was about to die up there and faint in front of everybody. So me now in my late 30s, I can have compassion for that little boy, and I get it. Like, I understand, but I can also say to him, hey, I've got this. We can do this now. Like, trust me. And moving past our fears in that way. But as you said, it takes action. You have to be willing to go, I'm going to take some action to move past this fear. We can sit and get into the trauma of it and into the emotions of it and blah, blah, blah for the rest of our lives. But ultimately, we have to take some action to start moving forward.
Yeah. Funny, the image that came to me when you mentioned your 8-year-old self was your 8-year-old self or my 9-year-old self or someone else's 6-year-old self seeing us now as grown-ups and how disappointed they would be if we'd still not let ourselves at some point, because they're like, oh, you're grown up, you're an adult now, you can do anything. That's what they see, I would think. So yeah, it's giving ourselves permission. Public speaking was a big one. We talk about fear of judgment. I skipped school anytime there was public speaking. I wouldn't go to college. I didn't go to university for public speaking. I did my first talk when I was 25. It was a 10-minute talk, and I had 10 slides on a slideshow in case I got lost. And then I set out and I set out to do 100 free talks in a year, and I did 88. And I was terrified. Like, every one of them, I spoke in fast food restaurants. I spoke in colleges, schools. I spoke in an old lady's shed. I would speak anywhere. And it was, again, that affirmation, I get better at what I practice. And so I have a story, and I wrote a book last year, and there's a story in there about doing my yoga teacher training in Thailand. And I'd done 2 yoga classes in my life, and I didn't like them. And but so many people were talking about yoga, everyone loves yoga. And I thought, oh, maybe if I do an intensive, I'll come to understand what it's all about. So I did my 200-hour training in Thailand, and I was awful. And everyone there knew I was awful, And a girl came up to me before my class, and she said, "You're remarkably confident for a man who can't touch his toes." So it was because everyone else was panicking about teaching their first class, as we had to teach class as part of the training. And I had no fear. And it wasn't because I thought it was a great yoga teacher, but it was a recognition that if it's my first time doing something, like, it's the best class I've ever done. It might not be the best class you've ever been to, but like, it's the best. And it kind of similar to that, I mentioned martial arts. I love martial arts. And when people get into it, they think about the black belt. But someone said to me, the most important belt in the martial arts journey is the white belt. When you take off your jeans belt and you put on a white belt and you start the journey. So I think that's true for anything. You'll never get to the black belt. You'll never get to the expert or mastery level. You'll never get to anywhere unless you allow yourself to start. And, tied in with all of that is the reality that we can do anything, but we can't do everything. And so I think you have to decide, like, I'm not going to be a dancer in my lifetime. I'll get out on the dance floor, but I'm not going to be a quality dancer because I want to be a jiu-jitsu black belt, and I want to be a men's work genius, and I want to, I've got certain things that I'm narrowing in on. And I think that's part of growing up as well, is to decide what you want your life to be about. So you don't have to do it all. But you should do what you do well, I think.
Yeah. And it was interesting, the story you told about the yoga classes. What I love is, like, it's almost that everyone else was almost tapping into this perfectionism, like, oh, I have to get this right, whatever this imaginary right is that we often hold in our minds. Like, we often have a very binary right or wrong, and everyone else in the class was like, oh, I have to get this right, or I have to get this perfect. Whereas you had a broader sense of, like, well, my success is just being here and doing the class to the best that I could in that moment, which gave you the confidence well above, as she says, for someone who couldn't touch their toes, gave you more confidence in doing that than people who may have been doing yoga for years and years and years. And it was simply, you just looked at the whole situation very differently. You chose to take a slightly different perspective to everyone else. And that was the very thing that gave you confidence in that moment.
Yeah, and you mentioned binary ways of thinking there, like the black and white thinking of success and failure, winning and losing. And I think that's one of the biggest things that can be debilitating in anything, because there's a tendency to, this is my tendency at least, if I don't catch it, is if I become interested in something, say I get interested in podcasting, I'm like, oh, who's the best podcaster in the world, or the biggest podcast in the world? Joe Rogan. Okay, so I'm going to watch Joe Rogan, and suddenly I'm unconsciously comparing myself to Joe Rogan. And now I've got a picture of what success should look like, and I'm trying to measure up to that, and nothing else feels good. When I was in the fitness industry, we would often get a client coming in on a Friday after a week of training. And the client would come to the gym and they'd say, I'm sleeping better, my energy's improved, I'm really enjoying the workouts, a little bit sore, but it's been a great first week. And then they'd stand on the scales and the scales wouldn't show the number that they had hoped for. And suddenly it would go from a great week to the opposite. They'd feel like they failed. And so the piece that I learned from that was that if you put all your metrics, if you only have one metric for success, you're really being binary with your way of seeing things. So, with fitness, there's loads of ways you can assess improvements, which are public speaking. If your definition of success is how many people showed up, that's one metric, but there could be 10 other metrics. So I think if you can narrow your metrics, I think the other thing I found useful in that journey was to ask myself, what worked well, what didn't work, what's my primary focus for the next time? Really simple. Like, what worked well, told some good stories. What didn't work well, didn't interact enough with the audience. What do I do next? Tell good stories and interact with the audience. Simple. And then repeat and try again. It's yeah.
Yeah, I like that. The metric. What metric are we choosing for success? Because, as you said there, with the comparison, it's very easy to compare ourselves to people. Like I even see how I do this with guests. I'm like, oh man, they're doing so well. Why are they going to want to talk to me and be on my podcast? And I, in the moment when I do that, I'm like, oh, wait a minute. I'm acting as if what I see is the success, and that's the only thing that means anything, right? And it's as if it is a real comparison, as if they're comparing themselves with me. It's a really unnecessary way in which we create kind of separation between us and other people as well by comparing and being like they're better or worse than we are. And it kind of creates this like removal of connection, because we kind of feel like, oh, well, now I have to be perfect. As you were saying, if you're going through Joe Rogan, you're like, oh, this is success. And anything else, anything that's not 100%, if it's not 100%, then it's failure. So 99% and below is failure. And that creates a really narrow band of, a narrow band of success that we can really use to like beat ourselves up with the really big, heavy baseball bat, right? And it kind of even ties into the judgment. It makes it very easy for us to judge ourselves constantly if our metric for success is that top 1% only.
Yeah, I met a lady at a seminar a couple of years ago, and she came up at the end. She was asking about coaching, and I said, what's your story? Where are you? What are you doing? And she said a year before, her partner had left. The bank had taken her house, and her business had fallen apart. So everything, her whole life had turned upside down. She was in her 60s. And she said, to focus my attention, I signed up to an Ironman triathlon, which is a 3.8 kilometer swim, I think 180 kilometers on the bike, and then a full marathon. And so I asked her what her background was in endurance sport. She said, I'd never even done a 5K. So like she's gone from zero to, and I said, how was it? And she said, I was really disappointed. And I said, why were you disappointed? And she looked at me and she said, my goal was to do it in 16 hours, and it took me 16 hours and 15 minutes. And generally when I tell people that, they gasp. But I also tell them we all do that to ourselves with the really binary. And so what I tried to do with her in those few moments was to find, I call them the hidden wins. So I asked her, did you get to see a new country? She said, yeah, I went to Denmark. Did you meet new friends? Yeah. Did your mental health improve? Yeah. Did your physical health improve? Healthiest I ever was. So that's kind of taken our awareness from, that's what the mind does. The mind is like a flashlight that's just going to shine on a certain thing, oftentimes the negative. And so that's why, journaling practice can be such a useful thing to do, is, can I find the message in the mess? Can I find the gold in the dark? Can I, so, yeah.
Wow. Wow, 16 hours and 15 minutes.
Wild. Wild.
And here we are, we're all doing it. We're all like looking at the things we're doing in our lives, and we're only, berating and beating ourselves. It's like I did some work with my a men's group I'm running around inner critic, and they sent me back all their forms, what they filled out, the questions, and a number of them really did acknowledge, they were like, God, I just beat myself up about the same things again and again, and completely miss all the great things that I'm doing, all the great things about myself. And as if I have a desire to feel shit about myself. I remember one of them said, it's as if I have a desire to feel shit about myself all the time. And I messaged him afterwards, and I was like, yeah, there is a part of you that wants to do that to yourself, but you don't have to. You have a choice. You can look more broadly at the success, like the lady you spoke to there, better, like it's funny because when you read out all those bits of success, it's like, well, that's kind of more important than that time. All those other things will serve you far longer in your life than that 15 minutes off you were from your goal.
I think it's Simon Sinek talks about the infinite game. There was a book written back in the 70s by the same title, but the infinite game, and probably get this a little bit wrong, but the idea is like a finite game is something like a basketball game where there's a start and an end time, and there's a score at the end, so we have a sense of who won and who lost. An infinite game is like, you're not playing to win, you're playing to learn, sort of idea. So whatever happens, you just keep going, you're going to go on and on. And an example I sometimes give is, if there's two tennis players and one has won 100 games and the other has won 50 and lost 50, your assumption might be that the first player was better. But the reality could be that the second player was playing a much higher level of opposition. And so sometimes these binary, if we can really, John Kavanagh, Conor McGregor's coach, wrote a book called Win or Learn. And that's really the mentality is, can I take that into my relationship? Can I take that into my conflict? Can I take that into all areas? Like, what am I learning from this situation? Oh, I'm learning I need to be a bit more skillful in my delivery of my boundaries now that I've decided I want boundaries in my life. I've learned that, when I do this at jiu-jitsu, I end up getting caught in a footlock. I've learned that, you can learn so much every day, but I think you've got to have a little practice of extracting the lessons and, just recognizing the infinite game. It kind of comes back to what I mentioned, and I think you shared similar about having a time in your life where you're chasing success and you get all the things and you recognize like that's not it, because regardless of what you achieve, you wake up the next morning and you go again, hopefully, if you get another day. And so it's got to be a continuous, how do I improve? How do I improve? Because, that's the key, I think, for growth and contribution.
Shifting the mind. Expanding one's awareness is, this is I'm sure the listeners realize this, like, from my conversation is I might talk about, dating, relationship, intimacy, but the bottom, the kind of foundation of it all is increasing self-awareness, because when we can increase our awareness of what's happening, I think the analogy used before was a flashlight. We stop having a flashlight and we have for some reason I'm thinking of like those big, you watch the Titanic and they have this massive light on the front that's like super wide and like lights up the whole sea. That sort of thing. We turn our little flashlight into that and we start to really see like, oh, wow, that little metric I had for success of like, winning all the arguments in my relationship. Actually, God, there's all these other things that are amazing that's happening in relationship. Maybe I should put some of my kind of focus and energy on that. It's something that we do a lot, is put our attention on the negative. I know it's something that the Gottmans, Julie Gottman talk about, the amount of negativity we generate in our relationship. It's often, and how the very thing that saves most relationships, I think they got like a metric on this, haven't they? They can predict the success of people's relationships down to like 96%. And it's all about, I think they call positive bids.
Yeah, I just started reading. They have a book called 8 Dates. Have you come across this book?
I've seen it. It's in my wish list on Amazon.
I just started. It's pretty cool, but they were kind of reminding people of where they started. I'll get this a little bit wrong, but it's kind of wild. So they're doing like couples therapy, but they set up almost like a Big Brother house where the couples would go and live in the house. There was cameras everywhere. When they would pee, they would take urine analysis off them. They would take blood work off them to figure out how stressed they were and as you say, I think 96% accuracy in terms of will people stay together or not. But their three pieces were building friendship and intimacy, improving a conflict with the recognition that there'll always be conflict, and then finding shared meaning. But yeah, that was the big pieces you mentioned is I think they reckon 4 or 5 positives for every negative kind of thing. And it's not like bypassing, but it's having an affinity to see the best in your partner, see the best in your relationship, rather than, that was the first chapter of the book I was reading yesterday. It was good. It was about commitment and sort of saying commitment is built on, how do they say it? Yeah, just really shining a light on your partner's qualities and your partner's gifts. And then the opposite, like betrayal, is built on shining a light on your partner's flaws and how someone else can give you better or whatever. So I would recommend.
Yeah. I picked that up. I'm a big fan of their work, actually. They're very relatable in their way. They come across. So I feel like we've really explored this fear of judgment. We know how it shows up in people's lives. We talked a little bit about how to overcome it and to kind of getting to that out of the comfort zone. I'm interested in like, what else is there? You know, I think you talked about earlier, it's going to come to me in a moment, maybe it won't, around self-compassion as well, around the parts work, as well as an effective strategy. Is there anything else you've seen for yourself in your work with yours personally as well? Because, you know, I know you're talking in front of many large crowds. So, you know, there's a lot of judgment one can feel if they're talking in front of 200-300 people. What are some really useful strategies we can start to employ if we are feeling that we're stuck in life, we're not able to kind of do the things we want because of the fear of judgment, and start to get into what we're now calling, thanks to my partner also, the stretch zone?
Possibly a few things. One is, I think as a journaling prompt, it could be useful to ask yourself, what is it costing me to let my fear of judgment run my life? And what would be possible if I could overcome the fear of judgment? So those type of questions paint a picture of heaven and hell. Like, where will I be in 5 years if my fear of judgment is the driving force in my life? Where would it be in 5 years if I leaned into this fear of judgment? I think that's a useful journaling prompt. I think a second thing is to express with people that you feel safe with. It's kind of like imposter syndrome, which is another form of inner judgment. The idea that I'm going to be found out, or that I'm going to be ridiculed or shamed, or people are going to a big piece with imposter syndrome that I think is important is to be having the conversation with someone else about what you're feeling, because there's the idea that what's universal is human, or, you know, what's human is universal. So the stuff that feels the rawest tends to be the bits where we connect the most. So just having trusted allies that you can lean into, and you can say, I've got to do a work presentation. I'm terrified. I don't know if people are going to, get anything from this. And you might just need a friend to say, you're really good at what you do. You'll be fine. Don't stress. I think that can be a good strategy. Another thing is, I guess, that the idea of the fear of judgment is like a big piece, right? So it could be to narrow in on, where does the fear of judgment show up in my life? Is there a specific area? Okay, it's in the gym. Is there specific types of people? My partner's parents? Is there, and really starting to hone in on where the fear lives, in what areas, are there specific types of people? And just getting a bit curious about that, having a curiosity around, okay, what is it about the gym that makes me fear judgment? I'm a little bit overweight. I haven't been there before. I don't know what I'm doing. Okay, is there something I can do to mitigate some of those? Okay, I could hire a trainer. I could hire a trainer for a couple of sessions, get them to show me how to use the machines. I'd have a bit more confidence. So I think it's really having a proactive approach. Identify the area, figure out what the trigger is and what's kind of where you're challenged. And then I think getting support. That's something that's with me at the moment, is the idea that the bigger the challenges you want to embrace in your life, the more support you need. And chances are the people you currently have in your life might not be the people to support with this next evolution. That's not to say you cut anyone from your life, but hire a coach, go to a public speaking group, get a personal trainer, have people. Maybe I'm just with this at the moment because I've recently hired a few people to support me with things I'm working on, and it's kind of like I asked them, "Can you hold this vision for me?" Because there's times where I think I'm too scared. There's times where I think I'm too tired. There's times where I think it's safer to go back to where I was before. I just need you to hold this for me for 12 weeks or for a couple of months, and I think that could be powerful for people. Yeah.
Oh, I love that.
And maybe I'll just say I use stretch zone as well, as a term, I guess. And the idea with that was around. Are you familiar with Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, the Russian psychologist? You come across this?
No, I'm not.
So Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, I think I'm pronouncing it right. He was a psychologist that looked at flow states in athletes, high performers, musicians, the idea of being in the zone. And he talks about this kind of addictive state of flow where time just flies by. It could be having a conversation with a loved one. It could be, anything. But what he recognized was there's a kind of simple graph that shows that when the challenges in our life are too small, we get bored. So go back to the Sonic example. If you stay on level 1 for the next year, you're going to get bored and throw out but when the challenges we take on are too high, we get frustrated and we get anxious and we feel worse about ourselves. So you go straight to level 10 and it's near impossible. So the stretch zone is the idea of going to level 2. And then once you're comfortable there, going to level 3. So I think they, I don't know how they did this, it's kind of nerdy, but they said a 5% increase is the key, because when you're stretched a little bit beyond what's currently possible for you, you've got to be hyper engaged with the thing. And so your inner critic's got to quieten down a little bit. So if you imagine rock climbing, you watch Alex Honnold, who's that free climber that does all the crazy climbs in Yosemite. He doesn't have space for an inner critic up there because he's so in the moment with, okay, foothold, handhold. But that's obviously happened over time. So maybe just thinking about where that applies in the area where you feel judgment. Are you stuck in a comfort zone? Are you jumping into a panic zone? Or have you found that sweet spot in the middle and gotten support to keep you staying in the sweet spot, I guess?
Yeah. And I love that. There's so many things there that I love, so I'm going to comment on both of them. When he talked about talking to others, it's something that I see as a coach, is that so many men come to me and the first time they speak to me is often they have never spoken to anyone about this problem that they're having. And then when they unload and they tell me about it, and I just sit and I listen and I'm like, okay, got it. I understand. I listen, and maybe some questions, stuff like that. I'd say almost 100% of them actually, after that, within a few days, usually that same day, they'll be like, man, I feel so much better for just saying it out loud. I feel so much more spacious or even able to start to meet that fear by simply speaking out loud. They really can't underestimate the power of just speaking out loud to someone who will kind of listen to you. And you said there about obviously the support. And I'm like you. I've more and more. I feel like, especially as men and as me myself, is like I kind of saw support and help as like somehow I'm failing. If I need support and help, that I've failed to do it on my own. But in the last kind of 5 or 6 years, that it's literally been like, okay, I need help with something. Who can I go to? Like, okay, there's a coach here, there's a friend here, there's someone that knows. And I've really leaned into it this year. Like I'm currently in like 2 group programs. I've got a coach for myself. I've got me and my partner. We have a coach for our vision. And I think that's the bit that stood out, is like finding someone, speaking to someone who can hold the vision of you, what you want, and will speak to you from that place and will hold you to that. So in those moments when you don't believe in yourself and you don't believe it's possible for you to stretch outside your comfort zone, this person is standing there in complete belief in you that this is possible for you. And it's incredibly powerful how much that can shift how we feel about ourselves, because especially when we talk about judgment, the opposite, I guess, of judgment is belief, right? If someone is acceptance and belief and they're shining that acceptance and belief at us, we're absorbing it. We're like, oh, the thing I thought I was going to be judged about isn't being judged. I'm being accepted. Oh, that dissolves away some of my own thinking because I'm afraid of other people's judgment and it's not happening. And I get to kind of experience myself in there. And the journal prompts as well. Like, it's so important to dig around in the mind. Sometimes we just cut off ourselves, like, oh, I can't do that thing and I don't want to look at it. It's like having the bravery to dig around in the mind and kind of see what's really there, see what's really holding us back.
Two things just in what you shared. I think the first is there's so much power in telling ourselves the truth. So as you said, like when you say something out loud, like if that's the one thing we do is start telling ourselves and others the truth a bit more, that breeds confidence, that breeds authenticity, because there's not a disconnection between how I portray myself and who I actually am. So I think that's important. The second thing that kind of jumps out to me is, like, we all have areas of our life or areas of our life where we're struggling. It could be I struggle to communicate, I struggle to hold boundaries, I struggle to express what I want sexually in my relationship. You know, so many specifics. I struggle with job interviews, I struggle with like finding the thing. Like, that stuff takes up a lot of mental bandwidth in the background, even when it doesn't feel like it. So I think there's so much power in picking the thing that's taking up space and just making a commitment and saying, I'm going into a container for the next 12 weeks and I'm going to create a new result in this area. And again, back to that mantra, I get better at the things that I practice, and I can run from my fears, I can run from my insecurities, I can run from my weak points, or I can lean into them and recognize that, I just haven't practiced. I just need to practice. It's kind of my focus at the moment. I hired a personal trainer. I'd come from the fitness background, and I know it all. I know too much, and I kept switching the plan and all this kind of stuff. So I hired a trainer. I said, I'm going to do what you tell me to do. So I'm 5 weeks in, and I just really appreciated having the support. So I'm going to get someone to support me in relationship. Okay, I'm going to join another men's group, and can't do it all on your own, I think.
That's an important message there. We can't, and we can lean on the knowledge and wisdom of other people when we involve them in our lives in that way. And also, as you said about your PT, you can actually remove a lot of your own thinking about it, and you can just follow the plan. And there's one of my old mentors, William Whitecloud, he says, like, structure has integrity. And it's like when we have a structure to follow and someone else has given to us and we just follow it and we don't try and second guess it constantly, it really has a powerful effect on us, and we just follow through with the structure that's there.
Nice. Structure has integrity. I like it.
Yeah. I love that one. Well, I've just seen that the time is running away with us very quickly. So probably a good time to kind of wrap up there. And I'm sure the listeners, after hearing so much of your wisdom and the breadth of your knowledge, I know from just having a quick peek at your website before, I was like, wow, there's fitness. And then there's like all this psychotherapy and compassionate inquiry. There's like imago dialogue. It's like such a wealth of experience and all the breath work that you've done as well. So I'm sure the listeners are really wondering how they can get more of Pat. They can hear more from Pat. They can connect with him, go spend time with him in person.
Thank you, man. Yeah, I've enjoyed this. Thank you. PatDivilly.com is my website. Instagram, I'm on Instagram. It's Pat Divilly. I'm not a big social media fan in recent years, but one of my commitments, I've got an accountability buddy, is to put up 4 reels a week for the next 12 weeks to just, so I'm saying that out loud here as well. And it's just been interesting because I was the fitness guy years ago, and then I was a mindset guy or whatever, and it's more trauma and men's work and stuff over the last couple of years. I felt like my social media content doesn't reflect where I'm at right now. So there's definitely some fear of judgment. Oh, well, he's the fitness guy, now he's doing this. So that's definitely comes up for me now as well. So I guess my action to kind of alleviate that a little bit is to start putting up some reels, and I guess tying a few of the things we've talked about today, let go of the binary success metric of how many likes or shares or whatever it is, and just do it and to practice. So PatDivilly.com, Instagram, Pat Divilly, and I have a podcast called the Pat Divilly Podcast. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'll be dropping all the links to that in the show notes, which you'll find below, or, depending how you're consuming this podcast, it'll be somewhere near the podcast. I want to say a massive thank you to Pat for his time and his wisdom and the breadth of his knowledge on this topic. And I'm sure Pat would love to hear from you as well, Because, you know, when we make podcasts, and Pat probably knows this too, it's like kind of just like putting energy out into the world. And often you don't hear much. It's like, so if you've learned something really valuable for you in your life, from what Pat said, reach out to him, let him know, you know, it's one of the most beautiful things to hear from someone who's like, hey, I listened to this podcast and I got this, this, and this from it. You know, it's like, wonderful, great. Like to hear the learnings, and it helps you with your learnings to cement them when you're sharing them with other people. As we said a number of times, sharing makes a big difference to our kind of cognitive understanding and learning.
Yes. Thank you, Rob. Appreciate you.
Awesome. Thank you, listeners. And we'll be back very soon with another episode.